Alleluia, Alleluia. Everybody sing Alleluia, for the Lord has risen, it is true. Everybody sing Alleluia. 30 years he walked the land. Alleluia, Alleluia. To all in need he lent his hand. Alleluia, Alleluia, Alleluia. Everybody
Hi,
sing
welcome to the Ascent of Mount Carmel YouTube channel. This channel is primarily devoted to a reading and better understanding of the book Ascent of Mount Carmel by St. John of the Cross. If you haven't checked out those videos, I encourage you to do so. This playlist, however, is devoted to an understanding of the Second Vatican Council. And we're very slowly working our way through history, looking at some of the events that led to the Second Vatican Council and might have some effect on it. Now, I'm very hopeful that we're going to actually get to the 20th century pretty soon. I'm hopeful that by Christmas, perhaps by the New Year, we'll do so. Today, we're up to the 1300s. We're discussing the Western Schism, and that lasted from 1378 to 1417, just about 40 years. The schism had its roots, perhaps, 75 years before the actual schism, because at the beginning of the 1300s, there was a series of disputes between the Pope Boniface VIII, and the King of France, Philip IV. In 1302, Pope Boniface issued a papal bull, Unum Sanctum, and the bull stated, "Furthermore, we declare, we proclaim, we define that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff." Now, with the issuance of the bull, this became part of established Catholic dogma. However, it didn't sit very well with the King of France, Philip. The following year, he sent a delegation that forcibly dragged the Pope back to France. Now, Philip, incidentally, was the king who decided to suppress the Knights Templar, and he confiscated their property because he was in debt to them. Ironically, Philip is remembered in history as Philip the Fair. Well, Philip had Boniface beaten, and unfortunately Boniface died 3 days later from his injuries. Subsequent popes were French, and they reigned from Avignon, which was in France. And this is the beginning of what became known as the Avignon Papacy. And this all lasted until the year 1377, when there was a new King of France and then there was a new Pope. Pope Gregory XI, who was French, decided to return to Rome, and he did so in part in response to the encouragement of St. Catherine of Siena. However, it was over the objections of most of the cardinals and the King of France. Unfortunately, Gregory died just 1 year after returning to Rome. So it was time to elect a new Pope, and 16 cardinals met in Rome to elect a new one. During the proceeding, though, there was a mob of Romans, and many of them were intoxicated, and they surrounded the conclave, and they demanded the cardinals to elect a Roman rather than a French pope. And the cardinals, they probably felt pressure from the mob, and they decided to look for a compromise candidate because they couldn't find a suitable candidate from Rome. They looked to an Italian who had served in Avignon for a time, and he became Pope Urban VI, and he was the Archbishop of Bari in Italy. And Urban had been a respected administrator. However, the cardinals who elected him soon realized that Urban really didn't have a particularly present personality, and he was very prone to anger. And most of the cardinals who elected him soon regretted their decision. According to the Catholic Encyclopedia, Urban was whimsical, haughty, suspicious, and sometimes choleric in his relations with the cardinals who had elected him. Too obvious roughness and blamable extravagances seemed to show that his unexpected election had altered his character. Please note that there was never an allegation of heresy against Pope Urban. This was a matter of approach and personality. A majority of the cardinals who had elected Urban left Rome secretly. They were blaming their departure on the heat, and they met in a small town in central Italy, and they deposed Urban and elected a new pope, who was French, and he became known as Clement VII. After this was announced, Clement was driven away from Naples, where he had been residing, and he then returned to France and established his papal court back in Avignon. So there were two men who claimed to be pope. There were two lines, the Avignon line with Clement VII and the Roman line with Urban VI. And unfortunately, warfare ensued. Urban was surrounded in a castle in Salerno where he withstood a siege of 6 months. And on the daily basis, he looked over the castle walls and he anathematized his besiegers from the walls. Whatever positive personality traits that Urban lacked, Clement seemed to have. Clement was well connected, he was influential, he was an intellectual, and he was skillful in politics. So about half of Europe recognized one pope and half recognized the other. And it wasn't really clear at the time who was the legitimate pope. For instance, St. Catherine of Siena, she recognized Pope Urban, while St. Vincent Ferrer recognized Clement. So each pope excommunicated the other, and each pope appointed numerous cardinals to make up for the cardinals that had defected to the other side. And finally, with the deaths of Urban and Clement, Boniface IX was elected as the new pope in the Roman line, and Benedict XIII became the new pope in Avignon. When Boniface of the Roman line died in 1404, the cardinals in the Roman conclave who were going to elect a new pope offered to hold off on electing a new pope if Benedict of the Avignon line would resign. But Benedict refused to do that, so the Roman cardinals went ahead and they elected Pope Innocent VII. Now Innocent died after a reign of only 2 years, and then he in turn was replaced by Pope Gregory XII. Tired of all the infighting, the cardinals of both factions secured an agreement that Benedict and Pope Gregory would meet in Savona. They had arranged for this. However, both popes backed out of it at the last moment, and this greatly infuriated the cardinals from both sides. Eventually, a council was held in Pisa in the year 1409, and it was attended by 4 patriarchs and 22 cardinals and 80 bishops from both sides, Rome and Avignon. And though the council summoned both of the popes, neither of them came, though Benedict did send some representatives later in the proceedings. The council elected a new pope, Alexander V, and it was intended that he would replace both the Roman and Avignon popes. However, neither the Roman or the Avignon pope resigned. The schism remained, except the council, unintentionally, added a third claimant to the papacy. Alexander V resided in Pisa, and this became known as the Pisan line. Alexander reigned only briefly for about 1 year from Pisa, and then he was succeeded by Pope John XXIII. Now John called for a council in 1414 finally in Constance to end the schism. And fortunately the plan was endorsed by Pope Gregory of the Roman line. And the council secured the resignations of both Pope John XXIII and Gregory VII. However, Pope Benedict VIII of Avignon refused to step down, but he was deposed by the council. The council then proceeded to elect Pope Martin V, and this essentially ended the schism, though Benedict of Avignon continued to reign from his court in Avignon until his death. But for all intents and purposes, the schism ended with the election of Martin. So the church was in a very serious schism for about 40 years. And there were no questions about dogma throughout this, and there were no heresies that were introduced. Everyone involved knew that there could be only one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, but it really wasn't clear who headed that church. It wasn't clear to whom obedience was owed. It was a schism in which there was really no schismatic intention. People followed the lead of their secular rulers regarding which line they should follow, but even the secular leaders really weren't sure. So they followed the candidate they felt would better further their personal and national interests. So there are some takeaways from this. There were ordinations and appointments that were made by all 3 lines. And we know that 2 of these lines were led by anti-popes. And however, after the reconciliation, the church regarded all ordinations made by all 3 lines as being valid. And after the reconciliation, there was no attempt to determine or declare which of the 3 lines had been valid. And there was no effort to have the priests and bishops be reordained just to make sure. It was actually too painful of an experience for them to want to hammer through this. And another thing I'd like to look at very briefly is that over the last couple of years there have been several articles as to whether a heretical pope can be deposed. People refer to the writings of St. Robert Bellarmine, who is a saint and a doctor of the Church. St. Robert said that it would be possible to depose a heretical pope. However, history shows us that if a pope is deposed, the pope needs to agree to step down. We see from very recent history that a pope can be forced to resign. However, this opens up the issue of whether a coerced resignation is a legitimate resignation. As we noted, at the end of the Western Schism, it really wasn't clear which line really was legitimate. The issue was resolved to a certain extent in 1460 when Pope Pius II issued a bull in which he condemned all appeals of the decision of a pope to an ecumenical council. And this seems to eliminate the possibility of undoing a papal election by anybody but the elected pope. This seems to confirm that the Roman lines of popes was legitimate because they could not be deposed without the assent of the pope. The names of the popes of Avignon, Clement VII and Benedict XIII, were taken by future popes. And then the Pope John the 23rd of the Pisan line, his name was taken later by Pope John the 23rd in the 20th century. Well, I hope you enjoyed this installment of The Smoke of Satan. And we'll be back again soon with another installment. And take my word for it, we'll be in the 20th century before you know it. So, in the meantime, please pray for the church.